Okay, so I'm going to start off with a very old bio. It's very short, and I'm going to ask that you update it for me.
Okay.
So to start with, Mark Samuels Lasner, a book collector specializing in the late Victorian period, has contributed to Notes and Queries, The Book Collector, the Journal of Pre-Raphaelite Studies, and Browning Institute Studies. He is at work on a bibliography of Max Beerbohm. Now over to you.
Okay. That's all ancient history. I've written more and published more, but the Bierbaum bibliography is at this point dead in the water. There are about 1,500 typescript pages, but the thing became so confusing and complicated that I gave up about 15 years ago.
And why did it become so complicated?
Well, Max Beerbohm, claimed famously that his gifts were small, but that he had used them wisely. And he said also that he thought he had 1,500 readers in England and maybe 1,000 in America. Well, it turns out his gifts were large and his output was large as well. Bierbaum created somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 original caricatures of the celebrities of his day. His collected works appear in 10 volumes published in the 1920s, and that's only about half of what he published in the way of essays, drama criticism, stories, and his novel Zuleika Dobson. His output was considerably larger than what he claimed or what I thought. And compiling a bibliography of Bierbaum was largely a matter of writing lots and lots of names of the people he parodied and caricatured over and over again, and trying to index the whole thing became an enormous tax. And I just, I got to the point where I couldn't remember exactly what I was doing with it. To give you an idea, one of the sections that was completed was the list of his drama criticism published in the Saturday Review from 1898 to 1910. And he was a weekly theater reviewer. So there are about 550 articles. In each article, he might review as many as 4 or 5 plays. So I had to list the title of the article, when it appeared in the Saturday Review, indicate the names and the authors of the plays, cross-reference to Waring's standard bibliography of the London stage. Plus, I had to explain the parts of the articles that were reprinted or not reprinted in his 3 books of collected theater criticism. That gives you an idea how complicated this was.
Okay, you know what? So you are going to be the giant, and someone's going to have to stand on your shoulders.
Well, I hope someone would love the idea of getting credit for finishing the thing. I started it and it got very, very complicated. Okay. I was also tracing, of course, all of his manuscripts, every interview that he ever gave, every likeness, and he was portrayed by fellow caricaturists, by many artists as well, photographs. He had a career later in life as a radio broadcaster, so I had to list all the broadcasts, where the typescripts and recordings are of those broadcasts. It got a little out of hand.
And you needed time to collect books, Mark.
I needed time to collect books. Now, doing, of course, a bibliography is the perfect excuse to collect the books and whatever of the subject of the bibliography.
Yeah.
So that was good, because while I was working on the bibliography, I was trying to get everything that Bierbaum ever did. And since I had acquired item A1, which is a leaflet of a Latin poem privately printed when he was a schoolboy, I figured, okay, I've got to start. I've got A1 and
Yeah.
I'll just go from there.
You got one of the toughest.
I got what I thought at the time was the rarest Bierbaum publication. There are only 2 copies known of. And that set me off, saying, well, if I got the very first separate Bierbaum publication, why not do a bibliography? And of course, there were other bibliographies, but they weren't that good. And I thought, well, I'll take what's in those bibliographies, combine it with Hart Davis's catalog of the caricatures, and make one Bierbaum reference book. Well, easier said than done. But I was able to, of course, collect anything to do with Bierbaum for the purposes of the bibliography. So original caricatures came in, letters, manuscripts, books from his library. Eventually, Rupert Hart Davis gave me Max Beerbohm's walking stick. I acquired an empty box of his cigarettes. The brand, by the way, was called Max, appropriately. I remember going one time to the Modern Language Association convention in New York. It was the big academic gathering of English professors. And we used to be held between Christmas and New Year's. And Tom Boss, my bookseller and collector friend, and I had lunch, and we kept trying to figure out, well, what bookstores are open in New York? And there weren't many. But we found that Appelfeld Gallery on the Upper East Side was open on a Saturday afternoon. So we went up there, and I'd never been there before. And it was a big room with bookcases, going at least 16 feet off the ground. I mean, they were, it was quite something. And we were asked, what we were interested in. And I said, well, I'm interested in Max Beerbohm. They brought out a kind of wretched copy of one of his books of caricatures. And the old man, the owner, said, do you mind getting on a ladder? And I said, no. And he pointed to the top of one of the bookcases. I got on this ladder, and I went all the way up, and there was a row of about 25 books, all from Max Beerbohm's library in Rapallo. And they were in terrible condition, and they were very miscellaneous, but some were inscribed to Bierbaum and his wife Florence, some had doctored illustrations, some had manuscript notes. And I kind of grabbed all these things, brought them down, and he said, I've had these, this is about 1982. And the owner said, I've had these for about 25 years because Bierbaum's brother-in-law was a New York doctor. And when his sister, Max's wife, Florence, died, Max cleared out a lot of stuff and shipped it over to Florence's family. Right. And he dumped all these books on his poor brother-in-law, didn't know what to do with them, sold them to Appelfeld, and they had been on those shelves for a quarter of a century. So I ended up with all these books from Bierbaum's library along with everything else. I even sort of came up with a term for this form of collecting, which is known as maximania.
There's a couple things I want to do. You are on the show because you are one of the great collectors of late Victorian literature in the world. So I want to take advantage of that.
Okay. And I thank you for the lovely compliment. And I should say that I like nothing better than talking about books and talking about myself. I think that's true for everybody who collects books.
But not everyone is you.
I hope not.
So here's a quote from our mutual friend, Michael Durda. He says, books don't just furnish a room. A personal library is a reflection of who you are and who you want to be, of what you value and what you desire, of how much you know and how much more you'd like to know. Digital texts are all well and good, but books on shelves are a presence in your life. Now, does he miss anything? Does he leave anything out there, Mark?
No, I I absolutely agree with that sentiment. I often think of digital books and the marvelous things that are available on the internet as parallel to physical books, but not a replacement at all. He's right. I mean, books do tell you something about the person who has gathered them. Their tastes or their aspirations or, their fantasies, their something about them. Even if they are simply a haphazard collection and not a purposeful collection. You simply look at someone's bookshelves and you try to infer something about that person. I remember my stepmother's books. I'm not sure what you could infer from this, but she arranged books on the shelves by color. So there was a blue shelf, a green shelf, a red shelf, and the lighter colored books were at one end and then moved along to the darker colored books. I'm not sure what the presence was, but it was unique in the form of a home library.
Did she or didn't she care about the content of the books?
These were books that had been, accumulated, acquired, and occasionally read, I think.
Okay, so I'm going to refer to an article that you sent me that you'd written called Collecting Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning, and it appeared in the Gazette of the Grolier Club, of which you are a member. The first quote has to do with the fact that you lived in an Edwardian house, country house, and you wanted to replicate that atmosphere. Is that correct?
That's always been my fantasy, is to not only collect to the late Victorians and the Edwardians, but to live in the period, hopefully with the same income I have now and the medical treatments available in 2021, not 1896. But really, I loved the period ever since I was a child, before I even knew what it meant to be, the late 19th century. But I loved my childhood, and I especially love it, as many of us do, looking back. If your childhood was a good childhood, if your childhood was horrible, you probably don't want to think about it. But I think of mine as being quite marvelous. It probably wasn't nearly as good as I remember. I do remember this was my grandparents' house in Connecticut, and I remember the house vividly. Now, lest people get the idea that this was some kind of extraordinary robber baron type family of mine, no, this was not the case. My grandparents rented this huge white elephant for $175 a month, just about at the start of World War II. And the house was, yes, enormous, but it leaked like crazy. And it was a kind of mess, but it was a fabulous place to live in as a child.
So why am I thinking about Citizen Kane and Rosebud?
Yeah, there's something in that, yes. I remember, I think in that article, I described the atmosphere of the house as something between Proust and Wolfe's To the Lighthouse, which is, of course, very much the case, because when you look out the windows of this house, you saw Long Island Sound and you actually did see a lighthouse.
Okay, so Mark, what was it then? Is it you loved it so much that you decided, or you figured out that by collecting the books and the literature of that period, what would that do for you?
I can't exactly explain it, but it was a way of connecting to that period. It was the way I had. Now, at one point, I lived in a house built in 1868, remodeled in 1914. So at one point, I was actually living in the right period house. I haven't lived in anything like that since. But yes, I mean, that was the perfect combination of the books of the period in the, the physical structure of the period. Everything about it appealed to me. Right. Particularly, I got to know something about the books and the writers and the artists. I was very keen on William Morris from a very early age. And of course, as I describe in that article, and everyone has heard the story, is I knew the last living person who had known William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones, who lived in a 2-room apartment in Bridgeport, Connecticut. If you believe in fate, I think this was fate. She told me stories of growing up in the 1880s and 1890s, meeting Robert Browning as a girl, of visiting Kelmscott House. It's an astonishing thing for, by this point I was a teenager, and astonishing for me to hear about the period that I loved from someone who had lived through it.
Yeah, wasn't there a piece of china? So there was sort of some kind of physical artifact?
Yes. When I graduated from college, at which point Mrs. Hayes was in her mid-90s, a box arrived. And in that box were several pieces of a blue and white tea set. These were the remnants of the tea set that William and Jane Morris gave her parents when they were married. And that started me off as a collector.
Okay. So you collected the second half of the 19th century, but you really focus on the 1890s, correct?
Well, I'd say the focus has been on what I think of as the Pre-Raphaelites and their associates. William Morris, Burne-Jones, the Rossettis, that group. And then the writers and illustrators of the 1890s, with a lot of other things of the period. But those have always been the focus. And I'm particularly interested in the connections between literature, art, illustration, publishing. That's always appeals to me. So if a book is an illustrated book, it combines the work of an illustrator and a writer that fit well together, particularly if it's an association copy. That really appeals to me.
Here's a line here from Matthew Budman's book called Book Collecting Now. And what he says is, the narrower your focus, the better chances of having one of the best collections in the world. So my question is, how narrow would you recommend it be? Like 1 decade, or is too much, or what?
Well, it depends on if you're collecting a period or a place or an author or a subject. I mean, whatever you could collect, unless your goal is, the 100 books famous in English literature that, to the Grolier list or something like that. It's very hard to be truly narrow. Though I've known people who are extremely narrow in their collecting interest. And that sometimes is that they want, books that have a physical presence of a certain kind. They only want an absolutely fine, beautiful book. They don't want any blemishes. That's what's really important to them. I remember once when Prodigy, the precursor of America Online, it's going back a long time, had a book collecting forum. And there was a discussion on the subject. And I remember you are confronted with 2 copies of The Great Gatsby. Mm-hmm. And they're both $100. So they're real steals. One is pristine in the dust jacket. The other is beaten up, no dust jacket, water stained, and it's inscribed by Fitzgerald to Ernest Hemingway. Okay. Which would you buy? Which is your narrow focus? Now, the person I was corresponding with said, I would want the one in the dust jacket, because his narrow focus in collecting was the pristine copy. His ideas, he wanted to, in a sense, pretend that he had walked into a bookstore.
Yeah,
Bought that book brand new.
Yeah.
I wouldn't care at all. I'd rather have the association copy and find out what the story was. That's what would fascinate me. So even when you have a subject to collect, then there are different ways of collecting it that can be exceedingly narrow. I mean, I've known people who were, fanatical author collectors who wanted every work by that author, everything about them. I've known collectors who only want the books that really appeal to them in an aesthetic, or in some cases, intellectual sense. If a book doesn't have, some special meaning for them, it doesn't matter who it's by, they won't buy it. It has to really speak to them in personal terms. There are also collectors who will only buy books that they've read. There are so many ways, but yes, it is better to have some kind of a purpose if you want your collection to be more than simply an amalgamation of things you happen to love or you think are somehow appealing or important.
Yeah. You want to replicate the zeitgeist? Is that what you want to do?
That's sort of what it is. I want to replicate the world of the late 19th century in Britain and show the astonishing relationships and interconnections that almost every cultural figure seems to have with every other cultural figure. I've often imagined a digital project that takes, let's just say, a month or a year in Britain, and you bring into this internet archive every letter that is known of that year. So you have one writer writing to another. You have someone's diary entries describing their meeting with the first two authors. You have someone writing about the portrait of the diary keeper. Everyone seems to have known everyone else. Now, you can say that there are kind of coteries and groups in which this is especially the case. The Elizabethan dramatists, the Bloomsbury group, New York intellectuals of the 1950s, the beat poets, the Pre-Raphaelites, the Yellow Book Circle, the American expatriates in Paris in the 1920s. There are all these little groups where everybody seems to have almost literally been in bed with everyone else. This is what fascinates me, especially when you get people who you don't immediately think have a connection.
So you want to reanimate the conversation in almost like a 360-degree multi-dimensional way.
Yes, that's a wonderful description of it.
So that you can live among them.
I want to go to the Yellow Book dinner on April 15th, 1894. Sit there and watch all those people. What are they talking about? What are they drinking? What are they doing?
Your collection is like a virtual reality. Is that right?
Yeah. I wish it were, or maybe it will be. I mean, I don't know what technology will bring. There's some new thing I just saw on the internet where you can post a photograph and it becomes animated. It's really remarkable. And I'm thinking, well, the next step is to get a bunch of photographs and put this together and have these people have conversations.
Well, like they are in your collection.
That's right.
Okay, so it seems to me that magazines capture the zeitgeist as well as anything does.
Well, the current exhibition at the Grolier Club proves that point beyond any doubt. Stephen Lemazou's American Magazines, it's a spectacular show of periodicals from the late 18th to the 21st century of all kinds. magazines, because they are ephemeral, they're current, are astonishing documents. In some ways, even more so than books, which have a longer gestation period and more thought goes into them. And, they're written by one person or, a few people rather than the collaboration of a periodical with an editor, contributors, illustrators, printers, and so on.
Yeah. You have the studio, I guess?
There are quite a few of the magazines of the late 19th century in the collection. Some are complete runs, such as the Yellow Book, the Germ, the Century Guild Hobby Horse, to name three. Others, there are single issues that have a Bierbaum contribution. But because there are enough single issues, there's a pretty good sampling of British and American periodicals from roughly the 1870s to the 1930s.
The advertisements are so much fun, aren't they?
Yes, the advertisements are wonderful. You can learn an enormous amount about a culture from seeing the things that people bought or were being induced to buy. What is, of course, remarkable is how many of the same advertisements are still with us. There's not much difference between the patent medicines of the 1890s and the things that are advertised on television that are supposed to help your memory. Who knows? I've actually seen on TV recently some advertisements for what almost look like Victorian electric belts. So what's new? These are the same things. One of the magazines in the collection is called The Adult, the Journal of Sex. And it is not pornography at all. It was put out by something called the Legitimization League, fighting for the rights of illegitimate children and free love. It was eventually shut down by the police. But in this magazine are personal ads, and the ads are just like personal ads anywhere else, And so, there will be an ad that says, young gentleman seeks attractive lady for quote unquote union.
You know what there wouldn't be is young gentleman seeks other young gentlemen for union.
Not in The Adult, but I suspect there are periodicals in which that is perhaps disguised, but is probably part of the world of, sort of the underground of homosexual culture of the time.
Yeah.
Certainly there was a way for Oscar Wilde and his friends to meet up with the rent boys. Now, one of the joys of the late Victorians is that they thought of everything that we have today. There's very little that wasn't proposed by someone in that period. There's a wonderful article in, I'm going to say, Popular Science or Popular Mechanics in the 1890s by, I can't remember now, Octave Uzan, in which he predicts that at some point all the books in the world will be recorded on some kind of tubes, and you'll be able to read anything you want instantly. That's Google Books.
Yep.
There's an article by Tesla in a magazine in about 1902, in which I believe he predicts that sometime in the future, everyone will have a device they can carry in their pocket and speak to everyone else in the world. They hadn't really figured out how to make a cell phone.
I think Mallarmé came up with the idea of one book that contained all the knowledge in the world.
Right. They had all kinds of things. There are a whole series of future war novels that predict aerial battles, laser beams. We've invented nothing in the last century that they hadn't thought about.
And that's all captured in your collection.
Yes, I'm trying to, yes, because that's part of the period, along with, the Pre-Raphaelites and the Baedeker Guide to London in 1895. If it speaks of that period, it's potentially of interest for the collection.
That actually answers my next question. I was going to say, so what best captures the zeitgeist, do you think?
If you're thinking of a single book, that's very hard to choose. That's impossible. It's even hard to think of a single author that would be the one who would really embody the period. I can't think of anyone really like that. I'd almost say Oscar Wilde, but that's too obvious an answer.
Okay, on the third page, I think it is, of your article called Collecting Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Robert Browning, you make reference to the fact that the reason you collect is that you get a parcel in the mail every day.
Yeah.
I love that too. That's
Nigel, isn't that the reason you collect too?
it totally is.
Yeah.
It's such a thrill to go to the mailbox.
Even after all these years, it's still a thrill to think, something is on its way and it's going to be a package and I get to open it. I mean, isn't that wonderful? Maybe we're spoiled in the age of Amazon and, same day delivery and such. But certainly, it's one of the real attractions of, collecting in general, but book collecting in particular.
Yeah, and although you were, can we say, relatively wealthy, at least before you started collecting?
Yes. Yes.
It's not the exclusive domain of the wealthy.
No, and it shouldn't be. There is a reputation in the world of collecting that you have to have a lot of money to be a successful collector. That is not true. What you need is desire, knowledge, perseverance, the ability to consider how to find these things. And it's not always obvious where they are. In the quote unquote old days, collectors were largely dependent on two sources: booksellers' catalogs and physical bookshops. But now, adding to those are, of course, the search mechanisms of books, all of those things, which you can spend hours and hours and hours searching. The individual booksellers who are online. There must be a book auction or an auction containing books every single day of the year somewhere in the world. There are now virtual book fairs, as well as, we hope again, physical book fairs. I mean, I have a friend who retired, and I think all he did for the first 2 or 3 years of his retirement was drink coffee, eat ice cream, go to the gym, and surf the internet looking for books. And he was remarkably successful because he was determined. No, money helps. And there's many, many areas. There's a certain point where the famous books are going to be expensive or difficult to obtain. And that's not for every area of collecting, but for a lot of areas, you're going to hit some book or books to finish whatever you're doing or to really move your collection further, that you have to come up with some significant cash. But no, you don't need a lot of money. I think in this situation of the famous story, to me it's famous anyway, of the writer Edmund Gosse, who was a pretty decent book collector. And he was going in for 17th century English plays in the 1880s, an area that was just really becoming popular among collectors. And he went to an auction with a friend and he complained because he was outbid on everything by some aristocrat. And he said, Lord so-and-so just gets everything he wants. And his friend told Gosse, yes, but he will never have the pleasure of buying something he knows he cannot afford. One of the great things about book collecting is those books you want, you get, and you really couldn't financially swing it in a rational world, but you have to have it. And you say, I don't care, I have to own this book. And, if, I don't buy another book for 6 months or I don't eat, what does that matter?
Yeah, there's that kind of rush that you get when you've probably spent too much money, but fuck it.
Yeah. And those are the books that you remember. The run-of-the-mill acquisition, fine, I got this, nice, fine, put it on the shelf. But the book that, oh my God, I spent that money, you're going to really remember that book.
Yeah. There's a couple things. First of all, advice to a collector: read everything you can about the people in that period.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power. You, meaning the collector, likely knows more about the subject that you collect than booksellers, scholars, biographers. You will know more because you had more experience with that subject than most people do. And you build on the knowledge. Each book adds, or each thing you read adds something. And you may not be able to always remember, oh God, I don't remember where I found this information, but a lot of it will stick with you and you'll be able to make the connections that someone else might not be able to make. I discovered with Bierbaum that because he caricatured so many people, I was sort of a walking encyclopedia of the turn of the century, as far as men were concerned. Bierbaum did not caricature women. And names that would be truly obscure to most people were in my brain all the time. And so if I saw something, a name in a book or a book plate or an inscription, quite often I say,
Yeah.
Oh, I know what this is, but almost no one else would.
And therefore, you acquired whatever it was.
That's right. If you're really a fanatic, you have read all the booksellers' catalogs and auction catalogs that deal with the subject that you collect. And you somehow remember bits and pieces here and there. I remember going to a Washington, D.C. book fair, and these were held in a second-rate hotel across the river in Virginia. And there was never any place good to eat over there. I mean, that was one of the problems with the book fair. I remember going to that book fair and walking around and finding in the dealer's booth a copy of Ellen Terry's autobiography, The Story of My Life, 1908. It's a very common book. And the dealer knew that it was Max Beerbohm's copy because it had his ownership signature on the flyleaf. But he hadn't really looked at it. And I knew that Bierbaum had gone over the illustrations in pencil and in ink, doctoring them. Bierbaum called this improving books, so that the pictures became ludicrous. Men who didn't have beards suddenly grew them.
Right.
Women who didn't have beards suddenly grew them. And it had about 20 of the illustrations doctored in one way or another.
Your heart must have been racing.
It was. I wrote out a check. I took the book in its brown paper bag and I left because there was no point in spending any more time at the book fair. And I also was afraid that I would tell someone this and the poor dealer would hear it and say, oh, I'm going to put another zero on the price of that.
You got a steal.
Yeah.
I've got a bit of it's not as good as that, but I recently read a biography of a famous Canadian broadcaster. He started off as a writer and an editor, a very good one. This is in the 50s and early 60s. At least that's what I'm interested in Canada. So just the other day, I walked into a bookstore. I didn't expect to see too much, And then I just offhandedly asked if they had any old magazines from that period, and one in particular. And she said, "Well, there's a box over there. I don't know that we've got that magazine, but why don't you have a look?" Anyway, I plucked out 6 of them from exactly when I wanted. It was early 60s, and they were $5 a piece.
And the booksellers probably, after you left, wondered, what did that man see in those magazines?
Yeah. But again, they capture, as we've discussed, they really do capture a feel of the times. And there were profiles of important people. There were commentary on the politics of the time. There were these fabulous big car ads. It puts you there.
Absolutely. One of my favorite things in the collection is the series of issues of the New Yorker magazine from 1959, 1960 that contained S.N. Behrman's, I was going to call it a travelogue, but that's not the right word, descriptions of his visits to Max Beerbohm. These were later published as a book called Conversation with Max in the United States, Portrait of Max. They ran through about a dozen issues of the New Yorker. It's the only, or perhaps the first thing of its kind where reportage appeared in multiple, but not precisely sequential issues of the magazine. There's a big page that opens each section, and then, of course, as you get further and further, because these are rather long articles, they become single columns surrounded by advertisements. You start reading it, and then, of course, you start looking at the ads, and you're transfixed because there's a certain world of 1959, 1960 that's just presented to you in a way that you just say, oh, wow, this is quite wonderful. The articles are also, and I think this is true, the first contributions in the New Yorker that reproduce works of art not made for the magazine because they reproduce Bierbaum's caricatures. I love them. Those magazines are, you can just sit down with one and you're going to pretend to read Behrman, but what you really end up doing is reading the rest of the thing and looking at the ads.
Well, isn't it just the case that the reason that Mad Men, the TV series, was so popular is that they took real trouble to replicate in every single detail what it was like in those times?
Well, I've never seen it, but I was hoping that it would produce more people who would wear fedoras like I do, but it didn't seem to happen. The program, speaking of magazines, the program that I remember watching that was historically obsessive, that to a point that even Mad Men did not, I think, equal, was Boardwalk Empire, the show about gangsters in Atlantic City in the 1920s during Prohibition. And I remember there's a scene in one of the early episodes where the camera starts out sort of at the ceiling of a large room, like it's the lobby of a hotel, and gets in closer and closer and closer. And there's a woman reading a magazine, and you can tell that it's the real magazine.
That's great.
Of the 1920s. It isn't a reproduction. It's the real thing. There are various sort of documentaries about the making of Boardwalk Empire that come with the DVDs. And I remember the actors are interviewed and they wore either the original clothes of the period or precise reproductions. And they said that they noticed that the underwear was such that they felt and moved differently than they would now. I don't think you can get any more historically accurate than underwear.
Okay, now speaking of clothing, one of the things that defines you is how impeccably you dress. Why do you dress so well?
because I don't want to be embarrassed when I meet Max Beerbohm, who was a very famous dandy. Why do I dress so well? Well, my grandfather and grandmother were fanatical clothes horses. I sort of inherited that. My great grandfather was a tailor in New York. So I think it's sort of maybe in the genes. It's part of my, I don't know, it's both realistic, it's something you could actually do, but it's also, I have to admit, a little bit of, fantasy life. Yes. I mean, it's sort of that I wish, in a sense, I have no creative ability whatsoever, but I kind of wish, I like to dress like Max Beerbohm, or, I have other gentlemen of the past whose style, I would say, has influenced my own. The greatest compliment I've ever received in my entire life, I think, was from a woman who owned a little printing company in Washington, D.C. This is many years ago. Mm-hmm. And I went there to have them print, letterhead and envelopes. And she said to me one day, "You look like William Powell in The Thin Man. If I'm married, marry you myself."
Well, you just said you weren't creative, but listen to the colophon on England in the 1890s literary publishing at the Bodley Head. Of this edition, 600 copies have been printed for America and England, designed and set into century-old style and zap chancery types by Mark Samuels Lasner. There you go.
There's my claim to fame.
You said you're not creative.
Do you think, Nigel, I spent too much time looking in the back of books published by John Lane, The Bodley Head, and Alfred Knopf?
Well, okay, now here's a question. Why Bierbaum instead of Wilde or Morris?
How about all three?
Yeah, but you've really tried to complete Bierbaum, right?
Well, Bierbaum appeals to me in so many ways. He's the person of all of the people of that period that I would love to have met. If you read Behrman's Portrait of Max, which is, and I don't know how Behrman did it, because he claimed he didn't actually write any notes when he sat on the terrace at the Bellino Chiaro in Italy in the 1950s. He got Max Beerbohm to talk. And it is the best talk. It is the most interesting talk. It is reminiscence of all the people of the period, with wit and with kind of a sharpness that, Max Beerbohm as a character, he was not necessarily always kind. And I just love that. I would love to be able to just say, Max, tell me about so-and-so. Tell me about it was like to be at the Yellow Book dinner in April 1894. That's one of the reasons I love him. Plus, he was a great writer and a great character. He's like a window into the period. When I was working on the bibliography, I thought there may be 6 people, 3 of them booksellers, and the other 3 collectors, who would really look up things like, well, I want to know the variant findings on the Happy Hypocrite of 1897. But really what the bibliography was to be was a guide to British culture, politics, literature, the arts from, say, 1850 to 1930 by way of Bierbaum. So if you were interested in Sarah Bernhardt, if you were interested in Noel Coward, if you were interested in Shaw, if you were interested in Rossetti, if you were interested in Reginald Turner, it didn't matter. You could look him up or her in the index and find Bierbaum's writings about them, his caricatures of them.
So he really documented the age, is that right?
Yes, in fabulously entertaining ways.
That's a good reason. That's a very good reason to collect him. So how did you get started with the collecting? We talked about that teacup, but what did you start acquiring right off the bat then?
Well, there's the incunabula period of my book collecting when I was about 6 years old. This is when people on the street, when they moved, they wanted to get rid of books, they left the boxes in our garage. And I kept the books that I wanted. And I created a card catalog, of course, for my library. What I started with was connected with a senior honors thesis in college on the American arts and crafts movement. My first serious collecting, were the publications of the American arts and crafts printers and publishers, Roycroft, Mosher, Copeland and Day, things like that. But my real love, of course, was things British. And so I moved across the Atlantic very, very, very quickly.
You know, it's interesting. Just the other day, I was reading about Mosher, and someone, I'm damned if I can remember who it was, said that he thought that Mosher's stuff was first rate. Would you agree with that?
The contents or the book design?
Well, both apparently, and I wish I could remember who it was that said this, but he was impressed both with. Now, of course, he was a pirate, but his selection of the text and the way that he presented it.
Well, I think that his selection of text was remarkable, and he did a great deal for the reputation of British authors who were not necessarily unknown, but lesser known in the United States.
He didn't do much for their pocketbooks, though.
No, he didn't. As to the aesthetic of the books, I'm not a great fan of them. They're nice, but a lot of them, he did these series, and once you've seen a book in one series, all the other books look the same. I mean, he had some house styles, and that's fine. Most publishers do, and I think they're very nice. I don't really collect Mosher publications. There are a few in the collection, but he did make available to readers a lot of literature and actually a lot of bibliographical knowledge that was really quite unknown in the United States. Have you ever interviewed Phil Bishop of Mosher Books? Well, obviously, if you're a bookseller and you call your business Mosher Books,
right,
he has an astonishing collection of Mosher publications and also the books from Mosher's library that he used for creating the texts, which is really fascinating.
I just remembered who it was. It was A. Edward Newton spoke very highly of Mosher.
You don't think he was trying to be tongue-in-cheek, was he?
No.
No.
No, I think he was impressed with the quality of the printing. And
since Newton started out in the sort of job printing, greeting card, gift book side of publishing and printing, he'd know what he was talking about.
Yeah, exactly. As I say, I was quite surprised when I read it.
Lord Newton has now, I think, never mind, no reputation. I don't think many people have heard of him anymore. When I was in college, I grabbed all of his books. I thought they were absolutely wonderful. I mean, they're among the best written, most enjoyable. Sadly, and Newton owned some wonderful material, but he also had some duds and some things in rather poor condition. And there's always been that story that his auction sale was just at the wrong time in 1941. And people who knew of Newton's enormous reputation as the sort of dean of American book collectors, certainly the greatest living proselytizer for book collecting in the United States, were rather disappointed when the books finally came up at auction. I mean, a marvelous man.
Why were they disappointed?
Condition. condition, and some of them were not right, quote unquote.
Right.
His enthusiasm, as with many collectors, including myself, ran away with him at times.
Yes. Yeah, I read it in preparation for our conversation. I was reading the book collecting game that he wrote.
It was a bestseller. He did more to promote book collecting and to some extent really the love of books than almost anyone else in that period.
He's the reason that Bob Flack got into
That's
book selling.
why it's called Open Old Books.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, we touched on this earlier, but I'll ask it again. How do you answer the question, is this worth buying?
Does it speak to me in some way? Is there something about this book, manuscript, drawing, print, photograph that almost literally says, I belong in your collection, or I have a story, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. You have to buy me to find out. That's a very appealing thing to me, is to see something where I think this is interesting, but I don't know the whole story. I haven't put the pieces together. I mean, one of the joys I find of collecting association copies is when you find that the book, the actual book, is referred to by the author or the owner of that book. I mean, that copy, and you find out what they had to say about it. Sometimes it's just a perfunctory, thank you note.
Yeah.
But sometimes there's much more to it. And if you start digging, you come up with some very interesting revelations. Years ago, I bought a copy of Matthew Arnold's Literature and Dogma. And Arnold was the kind of author who gave books to friends and associates, and they are often inscribed something like, with kind regards, M.A. Not even, they were given to someone, but they don't even have the recipient's name. You can imagine how thrilled I was to find a copy of the book inscribed to Mr. Darwin. And on the back end paper was the ownership signature and notes of Darwin's daughter. But you'll notice that it's not inscribed to Charles Darwin. It doesn't say anything like, from your friend Matthew Arnold, nothing close.
No.
It's very formal. And it turns out that hard it is to believe that two of the most eminent Victorians were barely acquainted, Darwin and Arnold. When Arnold published the book, which includes a reference to Darwin, he was nervous about sending it to Darwin. So what he did, this is documented by a series of letters, he sent it to their mutual friend, Thomas Henry Huxley, who sent it on to Darwin with a note saying, Matthew Arnold has asked me to send this on to you. You don't even have to acknowledge it. And then Darwin did write a very short note of acknowledgement. But that inscription was curious. And once I found the story, it was much more interesting because it explained the relationship of three figures, all connected by one copy of one book.
So it sounds to me like what you're doing is you're trying to identify potential stories.
Yes. I mean, when Margaret Stepps curated the exhibition in Delaware for my collection in 2017, it was called Victorian Passions, Stories from the Mark Samuels Lasner Collection.
Right.
I mean, that I think is, to me, what collecting, in a sense, what scholarship, what biography, what really anything is about. It's about narrative. It's what humans respond to. We love a story about ourselves. We love a story about the past. We love made-up stories. We all go for this.
Well, it's how we make sense of things.
That's right. Yeah. And when you have books, the books tell you stories. and not just the text, the story that you read, or in a sense, sometimes the story that is shown in illustrations, but the many other stories about that book, about the person who wrote it, who published it, who printed it, who bound it, who owned it, who read it later.
Yeah, this is very much the mode of the new antiquarians, I think, is to really dig deep and find interesting stories about what they're selling.
Well, do you think, Nigel, that I can't really think of always think of the right word for this, but the kind of things that have come onto the market have been eagerly collected over the last, say, decade and a half, which are not by famous people or the kind of people who you can look up instantly in the Dictionary of National Biography. Say.
Right.
But people who can be identified and whose lives are present in archival material, photographs, scrapbooks, manuscripts, all kinds of things. This has become a major collecting area. The work of what some refer to as ordinary people, as if
vernaculars,
and these people who are called ordinary aren't remarkable. And sometimes these are works which it's unknown who made them, and they are still fascinating.
Yeah, and they're often voices that haven't necessarily been heard.
Correct. Right. Yeah. Correct. Or voices that were once heard but have been forgotten.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that you do with your collection is you actually, you do stuff with it. You produce catalogs and exhibitions, and you study it. Can you talk a bit about that aspect of what you do?
There are, in a sense, two kinds of collectors. There are the collectors who are secretive, who don't want the world to know what they have for one reason or another. And then there are the people like me who say, the more the merrier. I'm, in a sense, a custodian of this material. I gather it, but eventually it's not going to be mine. And I feel an obligation to make it available for educational purposes, simply to delight people, maybe to show off that I've got all this good stuff, make a few other collectors and librarians jealous, perhaps. But I think there's great happiness in sharing a collection. I learn from collectors, scholars, curators, archivists all the time. And I think it's a two-way street, and dealers, particularly from dealers. And I like sharing it in whatever way is possible, and that can be a publication, it can be an exhibition, it can be something online, it can be an event. I really like it when people use the collection. I think of so many collections that are hidden away, sometimes because collectors don't want anyone to know, and in institutions that have really staggering amounts of material, but there's no way to know easily because they have so much, but also because they will accept gifts, and they'll get someone's collection on a subject, and it will sit there, and maybe there's an endowment to buy something every year, and that's what they do with it. And I think there's been a big sea change of outreach, I guess is the institutional term, to communicate about collections in institutions.
Yeah,
I think that's really important. I remember early on going to see things in research libraries, rare book libraries, and it was not easy. I was basically, in a sense, a kid. Who was this 22-year-old who wanted to see these books? And there were places who, they made it as difficult as possible, sometimes impossible, to see what they had. There are stories of scholars, young scholars, particularly women, people of color, who were denied access to research collections. And of course, there was always that story that really a lot of librarians didn't want anybody to come and bother them.
They feel like
Preserve
they
it.
have to preserve, not
Right.
make accessible.
Right.
Yeah.
Preserve it for what?
But yes, exactly. But if you think it's bad in North America, you should try it over in Europe. It's really an eye opener.
Well, I mean, in some cases, they have good reason because they've had some thefts.
Yeah.
That they don't have the kind of, staffing and security that we might have in major institutions in this country. A lot of the librarians were not only they were very nervous about people knowing what was in their collections. I think in some cases they had good reason to be nervous. And now we're looking, and I think we should be looking at some of the practices of the past and of the present that have made access very difficult. In some cases, it was the donor or the founder of an institution. I don't know the current situation, but I know that at one point to see anything at a number of research libraries, you had to produce 2 letters of recommendation to get in the door.
Yes.
And I don't know if that's still the case, but it certainly was, in living memory. And those had to be from people that were known to the institution. And I can certainly tell you lots of stories where, it was impossible to get photocopies or photographs. You were not given permission to quote any of the material. If any professor at that university wanted to use it, they could stop you or anyone else from looking at it. I mean, all kinds of restrictions.
Well, that wasn't my experience, and it was some time ago now, but when I had the pleasure of coming and visiting you at Delaware, your collection is really nicely displayed around on the walls of a room. It sort of goes all the way around, and then in the middle, if my memory serves correct, was there a table there so that we could?
Yeah, there are a couple of tables. It's sort of my call it.
It's your showroom.
It's my showroom. It's my home away from home. When this was conceived by the University of Delaware, and I'm very grateful that they kind of, in a sense, made me an offer I couldn't refuse. I remember having discussions with the librarians and saying, well, wouldn't it be nice to have a sofa and some comfy chairs covered in William Morris textile? This was not a living room for people who are going to read books and take naps. This was a seminar room for study and research and for classes to meet. I got the message. The chairs are not as comfortable as I think they should have been, though they do have Morris fabric on them.
Oh, good. Okay, we're just winding down here, Mark. Couple more questions. Can you name 1 or 2 of your favorite booksellers and explain why they're your favorites?
Living or no longer living?
Ones that you've dealt with.
Ooh. All right. I'll choose 3 or 4. The late David Holmes, who, despite the fact that he traded under the name David Holmes Autographs, was also a purveyor of books. I met David in the 1970s when he worked for the McManus Company in Philadelphia. David's field was English literature, particularly the 19th and 20th centuries, and American literature. And speaking of learning, I learned a great deal from David. He really knew the books, the authors, the period, and was a brilliant bookseller. He was very, very calm, quiet, the opposite of aggressive when it comes to selling things.
Mm-hmm.
One of the great sort of scholar booksellers of our time, and I miss him a lot. David once told me that he thought I had put his daughter Sarah through college, which might be true. I bought a lot of books, manuscripts, letters from David. What did Sarah do? She ended up working for her father.
So she didn't even have to go to college then.
That's right.
Yeah. Did he produce catalogs, and
yes,
how good were they?
Over 50 catalogs, which were very, very good. He started out as an independent bookseller and then worked for McManus and then went back to being, his own boss. But David was, for many years, my principal bookseller. And as I wrote in a little piece about it in the Book Collector, almost no day, weekday, business day, went by without a phone call to or from David Holmes for years and years and years.
That's an important lesson for a collector, isn't it?
I wish there were more dealers like David who understood that what collectors need is care and feeding. Finding a book on the internet is one thing, but having a dealer send you in those days, a telephone call or a letter, now an email saying, would you be interested in this?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, I would. And that is a mutual benefit to both dealer and collector.
Well, to share your enthusiasm, right?
Absolutely. Of living fabulous dealers, I have to say Ed Maggs and Alice Rowell, who works for Ed, and all the people at Maggs are astonishing. I love them all. If you know Ed, you've heard him speak, you read what he's written, you know that he is an extraordinary person of charm and wit, a little off the wall at times, but extraordinary.
I tried to interview him once. He didn't return my phone call.
All right, tell him I told him you should Maggs is I would say my home in London.
Okay.
And don't let the fact that they have the royal warrant fool you. They are absolutely welcoming to everybody, whether you are Paul Getty or you're Mark Samuels Lasner or you're
Nigel Beale.
Absolutely.
Actually, true. I went into one of I think they've got 2 locations, and I think it was Benjamin. Is that right?
That's right, Ben. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a good chat with him. So yes, he was very well.
They're just lovely, lovely people. They have just issued catalog number 1,500.
Wow.
There are lots of really fabulous booksellers now.
Yeah.
I think of Heather O'Donnell and Rebecca Romney, Tom Goldwasser, Jim Cummins, all the people like Fran DeRocco of Kelmscott Bookshop, everybody that I can think of, John Crichton of Brick Row. I mean, there are legions of them.
What is it that characterizes all of them then?
Knowledge, the ability to understand that there is usually a really good home for a particular book. And if you can figure that out, you've made a sale. The fact that they are tenacious in looking for books, in researching them, knowing what they are, and that they are welcoming to everybody. There are booksellers, particularly in the past, who were snotty and snobby. There were British dealers who didn't want to deal with Americans. There were dealers who didn't want to deal with private customers. There were dealers who didn't want to sell anything to women. There were dealers who would throw you out of their shop for no reason whatsoever. Every human activity has its variations. Booksellers still have a reputation for eccentricity, which is fine. But they are, in the old days, they would actually hinder their own trade by their attitudes. That is much less common now.
2 more questions. What's the most interesting thing that you've learned from studying your collection?
It's that moment when I take a book off the shelf and I think, why is this here? And I have no recollection. it's just there. Sometimes I can figure it out, or sometimes it's obvious, it has someone's book name or something in it. What was I thinking?
Yeah.
How does this fit?
You need to write the story down. You need to write the reason down in each book.
Right. But then, of course, I often think now of many of the books on the shelves. And I think of this, not just my own collection, but collections, libraries in general. Yeah. Who's going to ever look at this? And then I think there will be someone for whom finding that book or that letter or that manuscript that you've had for 20 years will make their day, their week, their month, or their year.
Yeah.
And I just had one of these. I got an email from a very eminent scholar. And he said he had found a reproduction of the Max Beerbohm caricature of Walter Pater. And he said he'd found it reproduced, very poor reproduction, in a magazine from the 1920s. And I was able to write back to him and say, it's in my collection.
Oh,
and
great.
it's a high resolution image. And he thought he would never find it.
Right. That's very good. Okay, but you haven't answered my question. My question is...
I'm evading your question.
Yes, you are. I noticed. What have you learned about the period because you have your collection?
Oh, gosh. Well, I've learned that the people in the late 19th and early 20th centuries had all the problems, all the prejudices, all the confusions that we have. One of the things that is quite remarkable, and this is something I have learned, is that, we've all sort of known, okay, there was the Victorian period and the British had attitudes about everything, as we have attitudes about everything. And if you start reading the writings of the people, even people you admire greatly, or you look at their work, there are things that will bring you up short. There are very few creators of the period who didn't have a blind spot, something that you discover that you think, oh dear.
Like a blemish.
A blemish. And there are, for instance, Max Beerbohm caricatures, which are anti-Semitic. You could interpret them as anti-Semitic. There are about 2 that could be seen today as a racist. Mm-hmm. Though Bierbaum was not, he was an anti-imperialist, he would not have even, I think, realized that such things consciously existed. I could say that if I had to look at the ethics, morals, beliefs, prejudices of the people of that period and reject them by 21st century standards, I'd probably end up with a collection that consisted of Bradshaw's Railway Guide, the Almanac de Gotha, and maybe Roget's Thesaurus.
Yeah, so we've got good.
Or I'm not sure about the Almanac de Gotha. I mean, I have to admit that there are books that I've seen, and I have a very firm belief that to forget about the past is a really wrong idea. And you have to look at it, interpret it, understand it. And there is material in the collection that I think almost anybody would describe as, to use a kind word, objectionable. But even I have seen things that were so awful that I wouldn't buy them. I wouldn't put them in the collection.
Yeah.
But I can think of books that are there that, you have to talk about them and show them in context. I have this wonderful children's book from the late 1890s called All the World Over. I love this book so much and have shown it to so many classes that I had to buy another copy because it was falling apart. And it's one of those big oblong color illustrated books for children. And what it does is goes through every country and culture in the world with a little poem by E.V. Lucas and illustrations. And they're extraordinarily filled with every stereotype you can imagine. And this shows what British children were reading and seeing in that period. And I'll give you an example. How was North America shown to British children in 1898? Indians with teepees.
Well, that's like Canada with igloos.
That's there too.
Oh, good.
No one is left out.
Right.
You know, it's an extraordinary book. And when I never heard of it, I saw it and said, this is a fabulous book to show students.
Yeah.
You have to explain what this, because this, if you grew up seeing this is how you would think of the world. That's, I think, the thing I've learned is that the people of that period were very much like us. And you have to try to understand this is how they were. You can't say, well, isn't it nice that someone was, had progressive or good ideas? Yes, but don't read too many of their private letters. You'll find out things you don't want to know about.
Well, it's interesting. You should focus on that, the kids' book, because they were raised to be prejudiced.
I would say yes, they were raised to be prejudiced.
They were raised to feel that they were superior to certain people.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's how it was. And you need to think about this when you start thinking about what happened in politics or what writers were being published, what was being performed, because this is, as you say, it's what they got as children. It's awful to look at now, but it's part of that period. You cannot escape it.
And you should not escape it.
I wouldn't, I don't want to sort of say, you have to all look, everybody has to look at this stuff. No, be aware. This is what history is.
Well, and again, hopefully it's painful as we've seen, but hopefully we're evolving into being a better human race. Who knows? We may blow ourselves up.
I don't know. I hope the books survive.
That's right. Well, they were built to survive, weren't they?
A lot of them. It's pretty remarkable how well they have survived.
Yeah.
Though when you think about some of that material, those materials that do survive, you think, oh my God, that's part of a cow.
Yeah.
That came from a goat. That came from a sheep. This came from squished insects.
Yes. So, Mark, what do you get out of book collecting?
Fun. It's the one-word answer.
A. Edward Newton said that he got friends out of it.
Absolutely. That's part of the fun, is the friends, the people that I've met from, I think every continent except Antarctica. And maybe someone from Antarctica is actually, interested in Victorian literature. Yes, absolutely. Friends. I mean, all kinds of things, places I would never go. Who would say, well, you're invited to give a talk somewhere and you never think, oh, well, why would I go to this place? Well, you go and you have a fascinating time and maybe there's a bookstore.
I'm going to say, I've tracked down bookstores in all sorts of weird and wonderful neighborhoods that I would never have gone to.
Absolutely. It's true. There are people, there's places. It is fun. And that's how I see it. If it isn't fun, why bother with it? The idea of, well, I'm collecting books to show that I have money or I have taste or to impress people or because it's something that somebody thinks I should do. nonsense. If it's not fun, don't do it. And we all have a limited period of life, and you should be enjoying it and helping other people enjoy their lives. And I think that's really important. It's one of the things I love about groups like the Grow Your Club is the camaraderie, the friendships that come out of the mutual love of books and collecting. I think this is it's really important. And I think, it is a real community, the quote unquote book world. I hope it becomes a broader, more diverse community. And it's getting there, but it is astonishing community, of people really worldwide who we all speak a common language, the language of books. What more could we ask?
Well, Mark, I'm so happy to have met you, and I'm so pleased that you agreed to come on the show. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, Nigel. And thank you for the excellent questions and the great compliment about my clothes.
Very good. Thanks again, Mark.